Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives on a very cold mystery island this morning. And I just heard from David Cranmer Underdown that it's cold where he is. I hope it's warm for everybody, and that if it's cold outside, that maybe you got a nice cozy place to keep warm while you watch the show this morning. And I'm really looking forward to it. By way of introduction, I've seen so many charts that purport to show, here's the real organization of the deep state going back to the Byzantines and the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Romans and all of this stuff has been part of my universe for a long time. But I've never been able to say, well, yeah, this is the chart. This one I think holds water for me. But nevertheless, I keep seeing them, and they're very, very intriguing. And this one has been going around on Twitter lately, and I'm going to share it because I just want to acknowledge that I really tried to find the original source of it by doing those Google image reverse searching, but there's so many copies of it out there that I just can't say. But anyway, I'm going to share that with you in a moment. But first of all, let's say hello to our guest this morning, David Cranmer Underdown. Hello.
Hello, John. Good morning. And I'm happy to agree to have a holiday spirited show. We just had a great family trip in Kentucky, in Lexington, and had a wonderful Thanksgiving there, and did some wonderful touring and met some amazing historians of the history of Kentucky and the Ohio River. And it was and also horse racing, of course. So it was a great trip, a wonderful Thanksgiving. And so we're in the mood for the holidays of December.
Excellent, excellent. And you mentioned Kentucky, a state which I've only set foot in once, but it's the source of a great deal of wonderful American fiddle music. And a lot of my career as a musician was hanging out with a man named Guthrie T. Meade from Kentucky. I think he was from Frankfurt. And he had a memory and a collection of the old fiddle tunes and could and was sharing them with us. We would meet in his basement every Friday night and learn tunes and just really enjoy the musicality of a kind of music that's pretty much disappeared from the mainstream. It's been covered up by lots of other things like bluegrass and popular country western music, but it's still really close to my heart, and it's a beautiful, beautiful tradition of old fiddle playing that just keeps evolving over the years. Who knows where it started? Who knows where it's going? But it's an American tradition, and I think we need to hold on to those when we can find them and keep them fresh. So that's my little addition to our introduction this morning before we get into the content of what I want to talk about. But let me go ahead and put this chart up. All right, you can see that. I think I'm going to try and make it bigger, and that way we can go through it a little easier. There. Okay, so and just I'll scroll through it for everybody just to see you can see the whole thing at once, and then we'll go back and kind of break it down as we want to. So you can see what the point is that the U.S. here in the upper right is a colony of the crown. And what exactly is the crown? Well, that's complicated, but kind of like Satan, whether he actually really exists or not, it's important to understand the way he works. And perhaps that's a good metaphor for our ruling dynasty, whatever they are, that starts out at the top of the chart. How about you, David? Do you have an opinion of where this original ruling dynasty would have come from? Do you follow the idea of its, originally from Venice, for instance, which is one of the great ideas that I came across when first studying the Schiller Institute work.
Well, I think the way to understand it is the trade companies and the banks and the banking histories and the ports, the important ports and the important trade routes, that people were interested in, and trying to figure out, what the goals were. Why go to all the trouble of setting up these organizations? Like, what is it that you um, really want to control from going through all this work and establishing all these things? And my analysis of it is that it comes down to a lot of it comes down to the monarchs and the word of God, and who is the person that has say in what the word of God is and what the rule of law is, and if law comes from a religious source, and is that monarch part of the is the monarch considered a god or not? And going through historically, that's what we talked about before the show, as far as information for like my relatives in Kentucky or southern Indiana that would have grown on a homestead. They wouldn't have access to information. And like, my grandfather learned to read sitting on the arm of the chair of his grandmother and reading Bible cards from the small church that they belonged to. It's the same way that Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles were described, how they were educated at home. So it's a all these so I look at it like, when I go to a place like Lexington, Kentucky, I try to figure out what the connections are to this chart that you've shown, because there's great interest. Simple things like the monarch, Queen Elizabeth, visiting the Farish family, Land's End, which William Stamps Farish was, of course, the co-founder of Humble Oil with Prescott Bush, and did the tetraethylene deal with the Nazis. And Queen Elizabeth and Philip, went and stayed at Land's End next to Keeneland, and stayed there many times. Elizabeth, of course, was a great horsewoman and loved racing. So tying things like genetics and eugenics to horse racing and dog breeding, and also agriculture and the desire to have better crops, I think is all in the frame of reference of what we're talking about in this group, especially when you get into things like Rosicrucians, with Francis Bacon founding that with Invisible College, and the Gresham College, and creating the Royal Society out of these organizations that become the official mouthpieces of the world as far as scientific thought and expertise. So that's what I look for, is kind of real world examples that fit into these charts and sort of show the what the interests were, and how things are I guess hidden in plain sight is the way to describe it, that people talk about.
Yeah, I think of Venice a lot because, well, I've just been rereading Against Oligarchy by Webster Tarpley, which I think everybody should study. But the idea of what's going on is control of 100% control of the commerce, and as a corollary to that, everything is commerce. The control of the Mediterranean with slave galley transportation was the vehicle by which Venice retained its wealth and grew richer and richer. So I think the answer that I come up with is how to control the commerce of the world, and whether that has a religious side, and or is it a purely secular power struggle thing, a Game of Thrones? History tells us that the common people are always the losers. uh, the common people you speak of that didn't have a library, and certainly don't have the internet or any other access to really study these problems, would have to rely on their insights from the Bible and other things they read. I think Abraham Lincoln was a big Shakespeare scholar, and they would have had very few books to read, but then have studied them very, very hard. But all of it, as we studied the Schofield Bible a few shows ago, and I don't know if you saw that one or not, but the way that the Bible was annotated by this man named Schofield, which created a narrative that didn't exist before, that supports British Israelism and currently supports Zionism, which has a tremendous political effect here in the United States, with many Protestant denominations using that model of the world of the revelations and everything it's all been lined up in order to support the idea of British Israel and now Zionism that is so strongly supported for reasons I can't understand in our Congress.
Well, part of going to Kentucky and driving through Ohio is that a lot of the religious history of the United States took place in those areas, and universities were founded, like the Lane Seminary in Cincinnati was had come from the Oneida settlement in New York, which was started by Garrett Smith's father, who was the business partner of John Jacob Astor. So you can see where the East India Company that we're talking about, because Astor was a fur trader, but also became affiliated with the British East India Company and was an original opium trader for the East India Company. And then he, of course, bought the real estate holdings of Aaron Burr after the Burr conspiracy became the Astor Holdings, partnered with Garrett Smith's family. And then, of course, the Astor family has the intrigues of the Empire State Building being built on top of the Astor home, and then also the Chatham House being run by, I believe, Waldorf Astor and his wife Nancy Astor, the Cliveden set people that had the Profumo affair at their home in Cliveden. I believe that's the same Astor family that goes all the way back to Aaron Burr, starting the Manhattan Company and bringing, water supply to Lower Manhattan, and fighting with Alexander Hamilton and his Bank of New York and the American system. Like, these rivalries are very old, and but when they do the colonies, they usually create a school, a place of religion, and then a place of commerce, and that's usually the three elements of a colony. And so whether historically specific colonists were more benevolent to natives or not, you said before, historically it seems that it's never the case. It's all, there's always manipulation and coercion, or it's just part of historically what the equation has been. So it's just, that's where you have to decide whether your brand of colonist is maybe a better variant than another, which is a hard argument. But that's what I think ends up happening, like with now, where the goal is to just get people fighting, and in the Hegelian dialectic framework, where you're fighting a black hat versus white hat, cowboy versus Indian type discourse.
The Hegelian dialectic that nobody knows about until you do, and then once you know about it, you want everybody to know about it, but they don't want to know about it. The two pillars, the Joachim and Boaz, and how everybody's attracted to one or the other, like the different poles of a magnet, and it's a control mechanism that has certainly existed for thousands of years, and that's we are so easy. We're still suckers, just like P.T. Barnum said, a sucker born every minute. And so and then they keep us so busy, with our day jobs and everything, and then distract us in the evening with whatever distractions that we find preferable, and that we never can study it. But we're studying it, David, here at McDuff Lives, and with your help. So all of these things, the Fabian Society, the Privy Council, Le Cercle, which is often, like a European synarchist branch of the empire, points to the idea that everything is already part of the empire, and that's American um, politics, kind of stripped bare. Because if we go to the bottom of this chart and we see that, there is still this crown thing that has all the assets already and has everything tied up in commercial paper and security interests and the ownership of all the farmland. For instance, the British royal family is the largest landowner in the world. I, most of it is like rural Canada or Australia. So, but the idea that everything is already owned by the crown, and that includes the United States. So, what we might go back and say, well, gosh, was the United States ever really free? But I think that there's a time when we can delineate when we really started slipping back into the hands of the empire, if we were free. And I would like to pose the the hopeful idea that yes, we were free after the revolution. Yes, we were free up until uh, certain events happened. And I think those events start happening in the 1870s and culminate with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, which I think is 1901. At that point, the British interests seem to be uh, all over the place in our government. Would you agree with that?
I I think so. I mean, I've studied. We went to Sagamore Hill, last year to see, Teddy and Oyster Bay, and really, look into his family history. So he of course was a great Anglophile, and he was the person that hired Elihu Root to be his Secretary of War, who rebuilt the American army after the Spanish-American War. And then, of course, his Undersecretary of War was William Carey Sanger, and that was the man that hired my great uncle from Cornell that worked for him. And his William Carey Sanger's wife was Ethel Cleveland Dodge, who was a childhood playmate at Sagamore Hill of Teddy Roosevelt of the Phelps Dodge mining family. So it's interesting because William Douglas, which is the mystery name that I can't pin down for my great grandma from Trumansburg, New York. The William Douglas was the head of the Phelps Dodge mining company, and of course the Dodge and Phelps families were, partners with the Rockefellers as far as Columbia Teacher College, founding that. They were part of what was called International House, which is a organization that provides housings for exceptional foreign students to live on Ivy League campuses. That's now, very closely associated with the what is it, George Soros's brother, Daisy Soros Fund. Like Vivek Ramaswamy was a scholar. It's a very prestigious, Rockefeller kind of Columbia University based program, where we had the Harriman right next to the Harriman Russian Studies School at Columbia. So there's a lot of interest there, as well with Teddy Roosevelt and his, of course, being the police chief in New York before having a law enforcement history, having a Navy history, writing the history of the U.S. Navy as, I believe, what was he, 22 or 23 years old, wrote the entire history of the U.S. Navy. So it's, to me, it shows the lineage of what we're talking about, where we get a Winston Churchill as the striking a deal with the Persians to create the Anglo-Persian, or not create it, but to have the British monarchy acquire 50% of those holdings and convert the British Navy to petroleum. You had Josephus Daniels was Secretary of the U.S. Navy at that time, who I've talked about a lot, and then you had Franklin. FDR was the Undersecretary of the Navy during that. He had the mirrored position of Winston Churchill. So to me, it's really important that that the Delanos were Russell and Company partners, and partners with Asa Packer, and partnered with Joseph Seligman, that did the greenback banking for U.S. Grant in the 1870s, the period you're talking about. To me, they were all partners with them, and part of the East India trade. So that's why when FDR becomes president in 1933, and there are all these great changes, and there's this coup, he walks into the buzzsaw like Lincoln, where he's got the coup waiting for him. And and then great historians that protect the reputation of FDR at all costs. Is so interesting to me that people choose to take just a hard fixed opinion of a character, where I feel like every character should be debated, and think about the good parts and the bad parts, and who their relationships were, and did they have agency to choose their partnerships and family. I mean, that's not always the case. So I feel like you have to look at all those things, but that's when I look at like the Roosevelts and the history of Hyde Park, and the Shakespeare stories of Henry VIII's wives. Anne Hyde, I'm sorry, Anne Hyde was the James's wife. But all these, all of those intrigues to me are really interesting to talk about when you get to characters like deciding, was FDR the best president? Is he deserved the #1 spot?
A question I raised about 2 weeks ago in my Minefields, where I raised the question in 2 shows, was FDR a fascist? And I think it's a fair question, because if you look at his history before he becomes the great chicken in every pot guy that everybody loves, you see he's very militaristic, very, very much favor of U.S. Business taking over Central America, South America, and using gunboat diplomacy to do it. And there's an awful lot more to that story. And I 100% agree with you that most historians have just elevated him to a immortal godlike status, not to be don't criticize this icon of American history. Well, I wanted to pick up into one little thing that you said that I didn't know before, and that was that Joseph Seligman provided the financing for the greenback dollars. If I got that right?
Well, there were competing plans for how to mitigate the crisis, and the plan that won was the Joseph Seligman plan. And of course, Joseph Seligman was the man that suffered the most famous anti-Semitic incident of the 19th century in Saratoga Springs, when he was not allowed to rent a room at the hotel, and that became the incident that was kind of like the Dreyfus Affair type incident in America. So it's a I mentioned to you the other day, when I was little, we had a very memorable and horrible experience going to the Holocaust Museum when I was a second grader, and it was a traumatizing experience for me. But it's very much made me what it did do is it made me a student of the issues of what the Holocaust museums focus on, and who the people backing them are. And
Now,
so
you're
that
speaking about the one up in Michigan, where
in
you
Michigan.
live, not
So
the
in
one.
Michigan, we had originally, it was in West Bloomfield, Michigan. That's where I went to it when it was at West Bloomfield. Then it moved to Orchard Lake Road and is now technically in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And this is, of course, where Paul Whelan, was living, and Nathan Wolfe lived, a block away from West Bloomfield High School. All lived there. But this is also where the Ritchie Boys from Maryland had their very first reunion in the 90s at the center in Farmington now. And that museum has a very strong history in Henry Ford and the Dearborn Independent. These are all local issues. Dearborn is just 10 miles from Farmington, and so the fact that Lewis Marshall and Samuel Untermeyer were the lawyers that were going after the Dearborn Independent is very important to me, because Lewis Marshall he had a camp on Lake Saranac, New York, called Knollwood, and he was camp partners with the Eugene Mayer's sister and the Blumenthals, the head of Lazard Frere. And apparently a lot of these wealthy Jewish families picked Lake Saranac because of the Seligman incident in Saratoga Springs. And the Durant, who was the son of the credit Mobler scandal head, Thomas Durant, he would sell to everybody. And so these Seligmans and the Mayers and Blumenthals and the Marshalls all, were campers there. But the thing for me that's the really hard part is that camp was right next to the Trudeau Sanitarium, which was where my grandpa went after his dad died in 1930. As a 14-year-old, he ingested a peanut and lived in an iron lung at the Trudeau Sanitarium on Lake Saranac, directly next to the Knollwood camp. And so that was, just a terrible thing, because he's the one whose mom blamed Henry Ford for the death of his dad. And then to go next to the Lewis Marshall, who's suing Henry Ford. And then their best friend is Alex Dow, who's the man that introduced Thomas Edison to Henry Ford in 1898 and was the head of Detroit Edison Company. It's, to me, just so personal on like so many levels. And then, of course, the Trudeau Sanitarium is later sold by Gary Trudeau, who is the great cartoonist of Doonesbury that went to Yale and, did the Trump Doonesbury. He married Jane Pauley, who was a Kappa picker at IU from Indianapolis. She's a relative of my family. My grandma was a Pauley. It was never an acknowledged relationship, but to have Gary Trudeau marry Jane Pauley, and Jane Pauley getting her first television job from a television station owned by Sarkis Tarzan, who was my grandpa's co-worker that was the head of the Proximity Fuse program for RCA in Bloomington. It's just a really close, a lot of overlapping things for me, where I'm just, trying to sort it out. And my challenge is that I feel like I have all this information, but it's hard for me to share it and have it make sense. It's just a dump of way too much. And I have not, I'm so busy trying to sort it myself that I haven't done a great job of organizing it for sharing. So that's what I'm trying to do. But that's why all these things are really complicated, because
I understand. I mean, this is very familiar to me when I was first revealing my research into my dad's history and how emotionally caught up I got by I was afraid to say things. I was afraid that, one of my relatives would get a lawyer and shut me up or do something worse. I know what you're talking about, but also you have a big constellation of this all around you, whereas me, it's just really through one person, my father. And this constellation is you're working hard to understand it. At the same time, you're fighting against that inner turmoil that happens when you realize that this is your story. But let us try to step back a little bit and look at the big picture together for a few minutes. When When I look at that chart and I see the United States listed as a crown colony, um, it's a fair comment. I think that it's possible that we have, getting back to what I was saying earlier, if we ever had our sovereignty, that we've lost it by now, and we lost it back to the same empire that we fought to get away from in the Revolutionary War in 1812. But I've never wanted to accept that. So, what is your opinion, David? Have we lost our sovereignty, or are we now a crown colony?
The way I try to sort this is looking at major historical supercycle bubbles, like the Dutch tulip bubble, the Occidental or Mississippi bubble, the South Sea bubble. There was a Darien colony that failed in Panama that became the, Panama Canal was another trade company that failed. And so, like, I look at America like in different phases, and going to Kentucky was a really important part because that where in the country I was a big founding father super project goal was to connect the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay with the Pittsburgh and the Ohio River, and they wanted to create a logistics system from the new capital in DC and Baltimore, major port, and then have it connect to Pittsburgh, and then to be able to use the Ohio River to the Mississippi River to New Orleans, to have full access to the Caribbean and the all of the countries along the Caribbean. And this goes into the Knights of Golden Circle story that is another. I feel like it's like a Brothers Grimm horror story. You hear the Knights of the Golden Circle and you think, here come the KKK and the Night Riders with the lanterns and the hoods, and that's all it is. And instead of thinking, well, why was Aaron Burr meeting with the person from New Spain? I mean, New Spain, was also a colony, and New France owned the Louisiana territory. So you're going to do the largest land deal in the history of the world. So it's, I think, important to look at who the characters are, who the bankers are, the political interests, and not just fall into, there were some really bad guys that hated everybody that just wanted to go around terrorizing, and we stopped them, and take our word for it, we got rid of them and we're in charge now, and that's the way it is, or whatever. So those are the things that I try to look at, because the Louisiana Purchase is the foundation of why we had a bank war and why we fought over the American system that you talked about with Harley Schlanger, and the fight over the National Road, the Cumberland Road versus the Erie Canal. And do we, does the nation support infrastructure projects on a massive scale to support the state of New York and the Midwest and the Great Lakes? Are we going to, invest our capital towards that? Or are we going to, invest towards a more southern road? And, those became the Transcontinental Railroad question. And,
Yeah.
all these things developed into that. And another area that I'm really locked in on is the Illinois Central Railroad, because so many characters historically were involved in the Illinois Central. You had Stephen Arnold Douglas, Abraham Lincoln was the lawyer, the George B. McClellan was the surveyor. The competing surveyor was I believe the head of the War Department was at that time was the Confederate
Jefferson
president,
Davis.
Jefferson Davis.
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't he the architect that did the Opium Dome at the Capitol and did the surveys for the Army? I thought he was in charge of doing the rotunda.
I don't know about that. That's interesting. But what he was, and I did a show on this maybe 3 years ago, and early of my minefields on Jefferson Davis, was that he was the leader of the Southern Route Transcontinental Railroad movement.
Hmm.
And as the Civil War approached, the debate was between the northern route and the southern route. And the southern route would have gone through Texas and Arizona and New Mexico up to wherever, around Los Angeles somewhere, I reckon, or San Diego. But that would have opened up the entire West to slavery.
Hmm.
And that was the economic interest that was behind the southern route. And it was led by Jefferson Davis, whereas Lincoln was with the northern route. And,
Hmm.
you during the Civil War, the U.S. Congress, having gotten rid of the Southern representatives that would have blocked it, since they seceded, they don't get to vote anymore. So the U.S. Congress now just votes in everything, finance the Northern route. A couple of $100 million, and they're paying for that while they're fighting the Civil War. They've got enough money left over to finance somehow the railroad out to the West Coast that was ultimately built. So
It,
I'm not saying they financed it entirely, but they put enough money in it to make it absolute national policy.
mhm.
And so was the Civil War really just a battle between railroad schemes?
In Reconstruction after and rebuild as the same as always. But the other thing I think is important to remember is that the credit mobiler scandal was the Union Pacific scandal, and that was Durant. And then, of course, the Union Pacific becomes a very famous Harriman line along with the Illinois Central. So now we have our E.H. Harriman entering the picture as the railroad tycoon, receiving financing from Jacob Schiff of Kuhn and Loeb Bank, and also partnering with Ian Fleming's grandpa, Robert Fleming, the Scottish,
Wow.
uh, the future, James Bond grandpa, was also financing the railroad domination of Mr. E.H. Harriman of the Union Pacific Line, I believe is the quote.
Yeah, I think that's the quote. And so let's look at that moment whenever 1880 or so, and ask the question: was the United States still sovereign at that point, or are we already, or so entangled with Lazard Frere and the Rothschilds and the British Bank that we are already part of the colonial scheme once again? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that a lot of the West Coast activity started with John Jacob Astor when he set up the opium trading routes with the West Coast. So a lot of the history of the West Coast has to do with Astor, and then also the Russians. There was the Russian American Fur Company was the partner of Astor, and then of course they sold the territory of Alaska and Seward's Folly. So those are all parts of that story, and the thing that I put in the comments, which again I think was really abstract, but I think is historically really important, is this Miss Berry, the woman that was she was the first department head at IU. She was a classics scholar. She's the head of the Latin department at Indiana, and she was loved my mom, and my grandparents were great friends with her. But my suspicion is that she's related to the Berries that set up what was called the Indiana Colony in Pasadena, California, which became the Caltech and the Jet Propulsion Lab. All those things came out of this Indiana colony. And the Berry family from Indianapolis, where Miss Berry's family was from, they met with a family called the Newmark family. The Newmarks were the Rebbe's from France. And Mark Eugene Mayer, who was the father of Eugene Mayer, the grandfather of Kay Graham, was married to a Newmark, and they started the first synagogue in Los Angeles, and I believe also San Francisco. And
Just explain rebase for people that don't know the word.
So the Rebbe, the way I understand it, is that there is a structure similar to the Catholic Church where they'll have like a cardinal that's like the head, like um, the the St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, like the cardinal from that parish, I believe, is considered like the head of the Catholic Church for the United States. Is that a fair analogy?
Okay, so he's a
So
very powerful religious man
religious man,
in
and you have to remember that Bonaparte created a place for the Jews, within France. So that's very important that Napoleon Bonaparte, elevated and partnered with these rebbe's. So that's also part of the intrigues because of the being financed by the Rothschild banks from France and England were supporting the Bonapartist army, but also the Wellington army, the British army. So that's where this lineage comes from. Why they wanted to move to Southern California and start things like what was called the City of Paris was the name of their department store that later became, they later had like Levi Strauss was a family business, Lazard Frere, they were part of the Lazard banking family in San Francisco. Um, so why they went to California, I think a lot of it will be the story of um, moving to Hollywood and wanting to, what Professor Hamamoto and Peter Duke have talked about, where there was a move to get, there was patent disputes over camera and video technology that was happening in the New York marketplace. And so people went to California for multiple reasons. One, to get away from the lawyers that could potentially sue them for patent infringement, but also they had year-round climate and ability to have different scenes for filming movies and whatnot. So Southern California became a hub of um, you know control of information.
And that's not anything to do with whether the United States is sovereign or not. This is to me a worldwide phenomenon that just happens to choose to land there in sunny California. Um, how does this help me answer the question though? Do we feel that these financial powers are already running everything, um, or
Yeah.
is the Congress still in charge? I think of James A. Garfield as the last president that really had the idea that the government was in charge of the finances. And after that, I think that everybody's caved into no, the financial powers are going to run things, and we're going to have to just mediate our popular demands to meet the requirements of big finance. You comment?
Well, Mike, what I'm thinking about is why I say Pasadena is important and why Jet Propulsion Lab is important, in Caltech. And the the person that was working on rocket fuels was Robert Goddard at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And Clark University is known as a psychology school, and that was where like Freud and Jung came and did the famous Clark conferences there. But it has this interest where Buzz Aldrin's dad was also working in the chemistry department, and they wanted to explore these rocket fuels. So they used Charles Lindbergh, who was the famous aviator, to get in contact with Daniel Guggenheim, who was, from this banking mining family from that was partnered with JP Morgan, and they had the JP Morgan Guggenheim mining syndicate in Alaska and all these things. So this Daniel Guggenheim then starts the Guggenheim auto Autonautical Laboratory, Gaelic, which becomes the Jet Propulsion Lab. So you have Goddard, who goes from Clark University to Roswell, New Mexico, where you have all of the alien intrigues or whatever, is in Roswell, where Goddard goes. You have Lindbergh being a broker, as a hero at that point before he becomes the famous anti-Semite and moves to Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, to send his kids to Cranbrook. And then you have that person that was the technical advisor of the Rad Lab, Lee DeBridge, who was from Terre Haute, Indiana, who led the Rad Lab during World War II, goes to Caltech, which is the school partnered, and then also Thomas Hunt Morgan, who I've talked about. We went to his childhood home in Lexington that did the Fly Lab and had Hermann Joseph Muller as his student at Fly Lab, where Julian Huxley recruits him and they start biology at Rice University. This is before Muller brings James Watson to move next door to my mom in Bloomington, Indiana. But all of those, people are like in the neighborhood of Miss Berry, and so that's why I think this Miss Berry is the related to that Berry family that started that colony. So now I'm thinking, well, was there a falling out with the Lazard Frere people? And like I interviewed at Lazard Frere in Rockefeller Center in the 56th floor, like right out of college. My mom's sorority sister's nephew worked for Lazard. So I went up. I had no idea the history of the Rockefeller Foundation and everything. I went in the office. I had my interview. I failed the interview, didn't get hired. I was, devastated. I had no idea what Lazard Frere was. I knew it was a famous bank. I didn't know that I was in those offices, but that was where the British Security Coordination offices were, also in that same Rockefeller Center. So, I mean, it's abstract, but when I'm trying to put together how my dad ended up next to Lewis Marshall, the guy that sued Henry Ford for Dearborn Independent and Protocols of Zion, International Jew, all those things that we learned about at the Holocaust Museum, like how that all fits together. I mean, to me, it's so interesting how that it. I don't know.
It starts to look like a Shakespearean play drawn out over centuries to me, and the idea that Henry Ford was suddenly this very anti-Semitic jerk, and that Lewis Marshall would have to file suit against him, and the whole business of this fight seems a little artificial to me, and now all of this history starts to seem kind of artificial to me when we've done a lot of studies of the Civil War, for instance, and all of these conflicts that draw the whole world or the whole nation or all the people of a country into them, like the horrible conflict in Ukraine right now. These all seem to be run by a hidden hand or hidden hands behind the scenes, and not the result of the sovereign action of a democratic country deciding, hey, let's go beat up on that country over there.
One comment that I really was interested was Harley Schlanger talked about his call in to the Milton Friedman show, and how Milton Friedman gave him the same answer, that if Schlecht would have been followed originally, that Hitler wouldn't have been necessary, and that was sort of the Chicago boys kind of canned response to criticism. I'm very interested in that story because that, of course, Horace Greeley Schlecht is a fascinating character, and so I would like to try to build out that scenario. What did Schlecht want, and who stopped him, and what if done the way that the Milton Friedman and the Chicago school felt, wouldn't have required a strongman dictator Holocaust person to be involved. If they could have avoided that, what are the elements? Who failed in recognizing that the value of Schlecht? And I think I know the answer, and I feel like it pertains to why my personal studies as well. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I think that is part of the pendulum. It swings back and forth between Keynesianism and the Chicago School, Milton Friedman, and Hayek and the Austrian School, and that when when FDR is in power, it's a Keynesian world, and right now, we are recovering in this country from a hyper Keynesian administration that's lasted back, for quite some time. Now, you want to go back to Obama or to Clinton or wherever it starts, but right now we've got the American people, hopefully, made a decision. And was that decision based upon being fooled again? Was it based upon, psychological manipulation by Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays, the great tradition of how we've been manipulated? Or is America finally standing up and saying, no, this is too far. We've gone too far, but now we're going to have to swing back. And if you listen to Elon Musk, we're going to go pure Austrian school. He was praising Adam Smith's work, The Wealth of Nations, in his top 10 book list. So this is a signal, along with him being the Doge, which of course is the head of ancient Venice, where it all comes back together to the empire, to the empire that considers everything commercial value, and willing to buy, trade, and sell at a profit, lend money at usurious rates, and just exploit the gullibility of the common people to their very deaths without a pang of conscience whatsoever. Uh, the people are caught in the middle of this gigantic pendulum swing, in my view, and while we sometimes get a glimpse of the inner mechanics of it, it is ultimately in the hands of this empire that appears at the top of the chart that we started the show with, and that the United States sure does seem like it's a sovereign country with all the military and the flags and the bands and the ceremony, but like Shakespeare said, but for ceremony, but for ceremony, and that the illusion, the puppet show, that keeps the rest of us buying tickets and doing what we can to get by from day to day. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think you've drawn out of me a kind of a picture of where we're at, and that is that, yeah, they've got the pendulum, but it's so massive and it's lasted so long that us little people here in our little lifespans are only able to uh, poke at it a little bit. Can we actually stop it? Did the American people put their foot down in this past election, and are we going to see a real return to sovereignty in the United States? I hope so.
I hope so too. I, I just, but I do think the reason I asked that specifically was the Warburg connection, with Max Warburg being the mentor of Hjalmar Schlecht, and of course being the head of the German World War I intelligence organizations, beside being the brother of Paul Warburg, who was the head of the Kunenlob Bank and the author of the Federal Reserve Act in the United States. So I was very curious as to, when like Hjalmar Schlecht created IG Farben in 1926, financed that, if that was, that it became so problematic later, but if that was one of the initiatives that Schlecht took on, and then also the curiosity of harboring uh, Otto Skorzeny, who ends up marrying his niece later. That's, just kind of another interest. And then, of course, being the financial advisor to the Bahamas and Paradise Island when they're, setting up the Resorts International operation in the Bahamas, is also another fascinating Schlecht history. So I don't know what the what the right choice would have been, but I do think that the reason that I mentioned that is I do think Hermann Göring is going to be the burr in the side of Schlecht that is going to be very criticized, and of course that gets into the Camp King situation and being interviewed by James Warburg, the son of Paul Warburg, interviewed, and then you also had the Henry Kissinger and Reinhard Gehlen at the same Camp King, and then also the Dr. Schreiber that is part of the sleeper agent story was also one of the interrogators that turned on Göring. And so what I think the historical interest is that I think Göring's father had a very similar role to Cecil Rhodes, only in German West Africa colony. He was the head of the German West African colony, and so I'm just and of course he had a very long history with being a flying ace and with the Luftwaffe, and but that's what I think the the lead up is. And of course for me personally, that's the mystery Aunt Eliza marrying the handsome Brazilian University of Michigan exchange student, last name Göring, that lived in Steubenville with my grandma's aunt. So that is part of the intrigue for me also with the University of Michigan. And when I talk about the Ford and Dow and all of the Detroit Aircraft Corporation with Edsel Ford, Henry Ford, Charles Kettering, James Bushnell Stout, who did the Ford Tri-Motor, and Alex Dow, the person that's like left out of the story is the my great grandpa, I think, is an intrigue. And the reason I say that is because he was the subdivider of Barton Hills. He was the friend and neighbor of Alex Dow, and then he was after he died in 1930, when the Kaiser Fraser company that was partnered with Bechtel, historically, when they decided to buy the Willow Run and set up Kaiser Fraser, Edgar Kaiser himself bought 100 Underdown Road and ran the Willow Run factory with Kaiser Fraser when Kaiser Fraser did the deal in 48 with Israel to industrialize Israel. They built the factory in Israel based on a negotiation with Kaiser Fraser of Willow Run, the plant that Charles Lindbergh managed and Henry Ford and Edsel Ford ran during World War II, Rosie the Riveter, the mile-long assembly line, the largest manufacturing facility in the world, that was then in 48 became part of Israel. And there was a guy named Ephraim Ilyin that was the broker of that. And he also was the person that negotiated with Jan Masaryk the 48 Czechoslovakian war surplus that went to Israel for the War of Independence. And Masaryk was the protege of Edward Bernays, who was the president of Czechoslovakia. And that's his granddaughter's the one that was my mom's childhood playmate. And the other complication is that Thomas Masaryk, his father, and Beneš were the founders of Mafia in Czechoslovakia. They were an anti-Habsburg organization. So they came to University of Chicago and they, met with Robert Lansing and create the nation of Czechoslovakia in 1918. But they had a Mafia, anti-Habsburg, anti-imperial background was where they came from. So these are all the pieces that I'm putting together when I'm trying to figure out where these people come from. How did Vlachov Beneš know to go to Bloomington, Indiana and live, down the street from my mom's family and from Hermann Joseph Muller and from the, all these intriguing characters? How did they get there? That's what I'm trying to put together. And what my analysis is that it does go back to this Julian Huxley connection with Muller. And Huxley's grandpa was Darwin's bulldog, and Darwin's bulldog created the X Society, which was part of the Royal Society, and they were part of the theory of evolution, and that became the theological fight that we talk about, whether the evolution of man is God created, or how species evolve, and that became a theological debate.
I'm no evolutionist, I want the world to see. Ain't no man from anywhere born make a monkey out of me. Oh, the Bible's true and I believe it. I've seen enough and I can prove it. What you say, bound to be that way. Yeah. Uncle Dave Macon, song from the 1920s minstrel tradition, and a very, very picturesque but true sense of how people felt back then, and I think still right now, I don't think I want to be a monkey. I like to be, uh, well, how do they put it? The humanists, we are created in the image of God, and all of this wonderful human qualities that are the enemy of the empire, the enemy of the ancient Venetian and Roman and Byzantine and British and all the other empires that want to control us from morning to night, digitize our lives, sell the movement of our bodies as production energy, tying us to CBDCs and observing us constantly from millions and millions of satellites, all connected to the big computer run by Satan himself.
God. I just hope the computer isn't warehoused in the World Wildlife Foundation offices with cute pictures of pandas everywhere around.
I know where that's going. All right, David, you got to come back. We got a whole lot more to talk about. Thanks, everybody, for being with us here at McDuff Lives. Have a great afternoon. See you tomorrow with Marcia for our Friday chat roundup and live chat where you can contribute your comments and questions to the show. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.